I think we just had a few more people join us. Welcome. Please take a minute to introduce yourself in the chat so we can know who's here today joining us. Oh, thanks, Donna, for letting me know about that. So thank you, Abby, Wendy, and Christina for introducing yourselves, letting us know that you're here. If we can hear from a few more people, again, we'd love to know who's joining with us and what role you play in your district. And Tabitha has just posted our note catcher for today in the chat. Please go ahead and open that to have it with you throughout our session. There's a copy of our slide deck in there, as well as all the handouts that you will need and any resources for our session today. Welcome, Andres. Thanks for joining us. Great. So I think we'll go ahead and get started with our session today. So my name is Irene Teskey. It's nice to see some of you all again. Welcome to those who are joining us for the first time. I'm a senior manager here at TNTP, and I'm based in the Bay Area, so I might say good morning when I know it's afternoon for you all, so apologies for that. I'm going to be facilitating today with my colleague, Margaret. Margaret, did you want to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Margaret Bruce, and I'm really looking forward to working with you today. I'm also a senior manager, and I tend to focus in on ELA and academics, so I'm really excited to share some resources with you today and get to know many of you in our space. So welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Margaret. And so we're calling it our first session. It's actually first session part 2 in our drop-in school leader series. So today we're going to focus on ensuring students have access to grade appropriate assignments in literacy. If you missed part 1, that was included a focus on math. We have those resources shared and posted through DESE in case you'd like to go back and see those. So before we dive into our learning for today, we're going to spend just a few minutes orienting and connecting ourselves to how we'll be spending our time together this afternoon. So first, we just really wanted to congratulate and thank you all for making the time for yourselves during your busy day to be present with us. We know it's really not easy to shut your office door and be fully present to participate, so we really thank you for being here. Speaking of being fully present, we know it can be tempting to sign into these sessions just to listen in, but we always like to remind our participants that we strive for really high engagement during our sessions. So today you'll be asked to join breakouts, take polls, share your reflections and questions as we move through the session. So again, thank you in advance for fully engaging with our learning community today. And with that, we'd like to share with you a few of our values and norms that we'd like to embrace today during our session. So please take a moment to read the ones in yellow and chat the one that you would like to keep front of mind today. Thanks for kicking us off, Carolyn. seeing a lot of teaching practice, not perfection, and know better, do better. Those are two really great ones to keep front of mind today, as some of this might be familiar, some of it might be completely new, but we'll work through that together in our learning. So we have also a few virtual norms. Again, we try to have high engagement. So if you can be on video as much as possible, that would be great, especially during breakout rooms. If you must step away, please try not to do so during the breakouts, because that's really our time to come together to collaborate and apply our learning together. And if you have a question during the session, you need something, or you have a more specific question you'd like to ask, please direct message Tabitha Heyman. She is another colleague of ours on the call, and she'll be able to answer you much more readily and quickly than Margaret or I. So just very quickly to share a little bit about TNTP and DESE, we've partnered together on several initiatives in the past. And for this particular initiative, we closely collaborated and heard from a wide breadth of stakeholders to ensure that the roadmaps are aligned to the unique needs of students across the Commonwealth. We also wanted to be sure to include existing tools and resources that were already being provided by DESE. The roadmap is also organized around 3 overarching priorities, which are grounded in research that we know will support acceleration for students. And as you can see there, each priority is designed to create equitable experiences and outcomes for all students in a manner that's affirming of their race, identity, home language, and unique abilities. And today our learning will highlight critical practices around that third priority of ensuring strong, grade appropriate instruction. And here are our guiding questions for our session. If you attended last week, these next 2 slides will look familiar, but again, today we're focusing on literacy instead of math. And these questions are the ones that we plan to answer today. So please take a moment to just read them to yourselves. So we know that all students are facing challenges related to unfinished learning, and they'll be requiring different types of supports this year. With that said, we also know that regardless of the type of support that they need, they must have access to grade level instruction and tasks. Today, is all about understanding how to provide the opportunity of grade level assignments and one way to provide support to access them. Before we move on, I also wanted to pause here just to share a similar reminder that I shared in our last session, that I know for some of you, you might see a slide here and there that feels familiar, or some information might be something you have heard before. That is by design. So our hope is that you're able to deepen your learning today, as we're going to go deeper on some topics we've covered before, and then take that information and materials that you gained today back to your school to support your teachers. So while some of the concepts may be familiar, this is a chance to, again, deepen your understanding, borrow some of the language or training strategies that we use, and apply them to supporting educators back in your buildings. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and get started with our first question here. Why is providing grade appropriate assignments critical to accelerating learning for students? So as we usually do, I'd like to ask you to take a moment to share what words you associate with accelerated learning. If you have done this before with us, I encourage you to take a look at the language on the slide, and perhaps there are new words or language that sticks out to you this time that you're now associating with what accelerated learning means. So again, in the chat, words you associate with accelerated learning. Thank you all for engaging with us in that. And Jennifer, we know that this year again is a very challenging year. So we do appreciate you sharing that. We know that for many of us, that is a common place to be. We, like to keep that in mind as we move through our session today. So thank you for bringing that up. We know that that likely resonates with many. With that said, I'm also seeing new words that I haven't seen shared previously in some of our sessions around acceleration, especially this one around purposeful context. So I think that's a theme you'll see coming through today, just how intentional accelerated learning is meant to be, especially when it comes to the planning process. So as you've likely already heard or read in the roadmap, just to make sure we have a common understanding, acceleration is not about going through the curriculum at a faster pace, but it's about providing students with that just-in-time instruction that will scaffold them into grade level content. In other words, students, if a student hasn't mastered the earlier skills that are required to complete a grade appropriate assignment, the student receives that just-in-time support, giving them just the right amount of help to move forward when they need that help through scaffolds and other coordinated interventions. Remediation, on the other hand, we know is putting students in below grade level content to fill in all previous gaps in a way that is far less intentional at moving students quickly into grade level content. The typical approach to remediation, which again is providing work better suited for earlier grades, it won't come close to catching students up, and it will likely compound the problem. So though well-intentioned, again, it practically guarantees students will lose more academic ground, and it reinforces also misguided beliefs that some students can't do grade level work. And just to be clear, we know that even before school closures, we know that students often didn't have access to grade level assignments, especially students of color, students from low income backgrounds, students with learning and thinking differences, and English learners. In TNTP's recent study of the opportunity myth, we saw that students often were not even provided with the opportunity to attempt, let alone have access to grade level tasks. In fact, we saw that only about a quarter of assignments gave students the chance to meet the demands of grade level standards in the districts that we studied. However, across our sample, when students were given the chance to try grade level work and had the right supports to access them, students rose to the bar of the grade level standard more than half the time. And this was true across demographic groups, and especially for students who were below grade level or significantly below grade level, I should say. We found that students who were behind made actually the most academic progress. To be more specific, 7.3 more months of learning was done when they had access to accelerated learning practices and that approach. This year, we conducted another study with Zern that looked at acceleration and remediation that affirmed our findings. And you can find both of these studies, the opportunity myth and the work we did with Zern, on our website. And we highly encourage you to share them with teachers who at this point may be more reluctant to take this approach to learning. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Margaret to guide us through our first new learning for today.
Thank you, Irene. Welcome again, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So for this portion of our time together today, we're actually going to be examining a tool, which is really going to be allowing us to examine that second question there on your slide with the book. So how do we identify assignments that give students the opportunity to do grade level learning? So to examine this tool, we're going to walk through a very small portion of it, and then we'll actually get the opportunity to do some practice with it ourselves. The goal of sharing this tool is also so that you can then bring this forward to use with your teachers or to have your coaches use with teachers, practice in PLCs, and so on. So I am actually going to direct you to the tool now. We can move on to the next slide. Thank you so much. So I'm going to tell you that the tool is actually, if you scroll down in your note catcher, you should be able to see the tool actually there on the second page. So I'm going to go ahead and give us 2 minutes to just read through the tool. I know it's very robust, but take the next 2 minutes on your own to just preview it, and then we'll begin dissecting it together after that. So just listen for my voice to bring us back at about 12:19. And thank you, Tabitha, for sharing that link to the note catcher in the chat if you didn't have the chance to preview that already. That was a very fast 2 minutes, but I would like to welcome us all back. Really just wanted to kind of dip our toes into the tool, if you will. In the chat, I would love for everyone to just share out any noticings or wonderings about the tool and what it indicates regarding TNTP's vision for excellence in ELA. And as you share out those noticings, I'm going to talk us through the tool a little bit more closely. So as you probably noticed in your pre-work, the tool is really extensive. When you use it with your teams in a coaching session or PLC, it could take 30 to 45 minutes to do. The purpose of the tool itself is to engage in professional learning that will lead educators to internalizing the characteristics of grade-appropriate assignments in ELA. The protocol, however, is not something that you should be using for every single lesson, right? That would take way too much time. Instead, it's something that you may use for long-term individual planning, collaborative sessions, like I mentioned, PLCs or coaching cycles, to really better understand the curriculum and grade level instruction at large. In my experience, it's also helped to inform how I scaffold lessons without removing the rigor. This is also a really important protocol to use, even if you already have high quality instructional materials in place in your district based on the Curate registry. So again, how we plan and execute our lessons can still remove the intended level of rigor. So going through this exercise, as you'll see a little bit today, can support you and your team with understanding why your materials are high quality, and that can actually translate to stronger and accelerated instruction. So as you, again, likely notice, the tool is organized into 4 sections, and you can see those 4 sections on the slide here: content, practice, relevance, and performance. And as you can see in that gold box, we're really going to just be focusing on the content section today, as well as its descriptors. And the reason why we're just focusing in on content is because the tool is hierarchical. And what I mean by that is that we're focusing on content because it's the most foundational element of the tool, and it will give you good data to know whether teachers are starting with grade appropriate content. In a sense, this first section here is the gatekeeper. So if the assignment itself doesn't meet or rate highly in this section, then we already know that the rest of the assignment is also not going to be grade appropriate. So the content section asks educators to complete a text analysis, and we're going to get some practice with this in just a moment, to determine if that text is complex, high quality, and grade appropriate. And the reason why is that research has shown us that text complexity is the greatest predictor for college and career readiness. And so with that, I think that we can move forward. Perfect. So as a matter of fact, we'll only be engaging today with part of the content section. We consider the questions in the highlighted portion ones that educators must be able to accurately answer to effectively use this tool. So earlier, we talked about while proven largely ineffective, remediation can often feel really intuitive. And in literacy, this tends to look like interventions that focus on skills-based instruction, such as identify the main idea, rather than focusing on complex text, which is really what the Standard 10, which is one of the pillars of ELA, calls us to do. So struggling readers who are pulled for these interventions tends to experience fewer opportunities to read the kind of text that with support would actually close those gaps by building world and word knowledge. They end up experiencing much slower growth of literacy related to skills, and then this gap becomes cumulative. And also, we can't just start asking students to engage in complex text or with complex text in high school. These experiences should really be starting in kindergarten and every grade level thereafter to prepare students for college and career after the 12th grade. So additionally, yeah, there we go. So the writers of the Common Core outlined these 3 factors to help us better navigate what we should be looking for in determining how complex a text is. They are quantitative measures, which many of us, when we hear quantitative, we jump right to Lexile, right? What's the Lexile level? That is often indicative of the quantitative measure. But really, quantitative is looking at factors impacting readability as measured by particular computer programs, thinking about the number of words on the page, how many pages there are, and so on. Then there's qualitative measures. These examine the level of meaning, knowledge demands, language features, text structure, and use of graphics as measured by an attentive reader. So it's a little more nuanced, right? A computer program can't tell us that. And then lastly, we have reader and task, which considers additional outside factors that might impact the difficulty of reading a text. And so we are going to hop into a Zoom poll. And so that should appear momentarily. So for this poll, would love to think about which dimension of text complexity you're most familiar with.
So sorry, everyone, 2 of us are logged into the same account, so the poll is inactive. So we're going to actually ask for you to just put in the chat which one you feel the most comfortable with, just to get a sense of where we are today.
I think I launched it. Do you see it, Irene?
I can see it.
Yeah, it looks like a few responses are coming in. So thank you, Irene. Thank you, Tabitha.
My screen says you can't launch it. So thanks, Tabitha.
I can launch the rest. I'll make sure to launch them all.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, team. And thanks, everyone in Massachusetts for just jumping right into that poll as well. Really interesting responses coming in so far. We've got about 30 more seconds to make sure everyone has the chance to submit their thinking, and then I can talk us through what our comfort levels are. Excellent. 70% of us have participated so far. Well done. Keep it up. Thank you for that active engagement. And while folks are still finishing the poll, I know that this is a lot of kind of information and talking points. So as Tabitha mentioned, please share any questions in the chat or just hop off mute and interrupt me while I'm speaking. I'm more than happy to pause and clarify anything that might need clarification. Perfect. Thank you all so much for your participation there. It looks like most of us at 53% are most familiar with the quantitative measures, right? Thinking about what's the Lexile range? Is that text within the grade appropriate band based on its Lexile, right? Then followed by qualitative measures, reader and task, and some of us are not sure. So thank you again for completing that poll and for sharing your thinking. And I think that it ties really nicely into the next slide, because many of us, or most of us, said that we were most comfortable thinking about text complexity in terms of quantitative features, right? That Lexile level. And that's the first measure, right? The quantitative measure tells us how a computer analyzes the complexity of a text when considering the kind of vocabulary used, the length of vocabulary, the sentence length, right? Number of words, number of pages, all these quantifiable items. And most of the time when we talk about quantitative measures, we're talking about Lexile. As many of us all know, we can use Lexile.com's Find a Book to look up the Lexile level. And they also have a free Lexile analyzer. So you could put in a chunk of text and that free tool will tell you what the Lexile range is if you can't find the Lexile for it. However, okay, so we have the quantitative feature, but that cannot tell us everything about text complexity. And I love this example on the slide. So just quick show of thumbs if you're familiar with the Grapes of Wrath. You can do a thumbs up, yeah. Thanks, Carolyn, I see you. I appreciate those thumbs. So many of us are, we've read it or we've encountered it in our curriculum. So what I love about this example of John Steinbeck is that the Grapes of Wrath, believe it or not, is a 680 Lexile, making the Grapes of Wrath appropriate to be taught in 2nd or 3rd grade. As an educator, do you think you would present the Grapes of Wrath to a 2nd or 3rd grade class? Yeah, Tiffany's like, absolutely not. That's not going to happen with my 2nd graders. And you're right. So even though it is a 680 Lexile and appropriate technically for 2nd grade, we know that the qualitative features, right, the style, the word choice, the voice, make this text far more complex and more appropriate to be taught in high school and beyond. So that is why we cannot just consider these features in isolation. We have to be looking at the full pyramid to truly understand the complexity of a text. So this brings us to the analysis of qualitative features. And as I mentioned, these can be a lot more nuanced. So qualitative features include aspects like deeper meaning, themes, text structures, like flashbacks, for example, and like I said, are more nuanced and require very intimate knowledge of a text. Qualitative text complexity analysis can also help us identify what is going to make the text more difficult for students and what standards we can truly bring to life when we are teaching that text. So now I'm really excited because we're going to get the chance to transition into some practice in discussion with qualitative features, excuse me. So in the next slide, we have an example. We have 2 texts here. These are appropriate for an 11th grade class. What I'm going to do is allow us, we'll take 3 minutes to read through these 2 texts on your slide. So I'm going to ask all of you to read through these independently and be prepared after those 3 minutes to vote for which one you think is more complex and more appropriate for 11th graders. And 3 minutes might feel a little bit long. So what I'll ask everyone to do is as soon as you are done reading to please just chat done in the group chat, and that will indicate to me that we might be ready to move on earlier. And thank you, Tabitha. Your vote will be anonymous, so it is a safe and brave space to put your thinking forward. And with that, I will stop speaking. Please take a couple of minutes to read and go ahead and chat done as soon as you're ready to begin. Really appreciate many of you leaning into those choices for directions. So thank you for that. So with that, I am actually going to ask Tabitha to open up the poll again. Thank you so much. You are on it. Which text is more complex and appropriate for 11th grade? Nice level of participation again coming in. Appreciate that. We've got about 60% in, so I'll give us a couple more moments to get more votes. %73, 75. Okay, thank you all so much for your votes. I appreciate you taking the time to read and then voting. So before we kind of reveal which text is more complex and appropriate for 11th grade, and I'll also share that we, right now, 63% of us believe that text 2 is more complex and appropriate for 11th grade. Text 2. Okay, so before we kind of do that big reveal, I'd like to pose another question to the group. Let's think about these texts another way. Let's think about what point is the author trying to make with these texts? And let's start with text 1. So what is the point that the author is trying to make in text 1? And for this, you can come off mute, you can raise your hand, or you can put your thinking into the chat if that is, and I see some responses in the chat as well. Thanks, Jennifer and Matt. Yep, you can share. So what is the author's point of text 1? Abby, interesting contribution. Would you mind coming off mute and just telling us a little bit more about why you shared that?
Oh, that's just my takeaway from the first text, that's kind of, I think, the main idea of what's being stated.
Thanks, Abby. Appreciate that. Any other thoughts here? Lisa, I see that you're on camera. Have you had the chance to think about what the author's point was for text 1? Lisa Wielden.
I'm like, oh, is that me?
If you don't mind.
No, I am going, my brain is a little off in thinking that, so I had done the text 2 because there was a lot of inferencing and within it, you know, and that a reader would need to do, where text 1 was a little more straightforward. And that's kind of how I made my thoughts around which would be appropriate for an 11th grader, thinking that text 2 is a little more rigor. Not sure if that's right, but I'm also thinking, and I'm kind of distracted by this, I'm an elementary school, you know, person, and how do we, and I hear it a lot from grade to grade, that they can't access the text and the scaffolding and supports that are being put in place almost turn the lesson into a listening comprehension rather than a reading comprehension. And I'm trying to figure out how I would use this, and not obviously in elementary, but how do we not do that? And I know that's probably not answering your question, but that's kind of what I've been thinking while we've been doing this. So
Yeah, it's such a good question, Lisa. And I think that it's probably top of mind for many elementary educators. I think that this tool itself and this exercise would be a really valuable process to use with some of your coaches or with teachers as well, to think about the text that they're sharing with elementary school students and whether they're appropriately complex for their grade. Of course, you're also thinking from K to 3, right? Are the foundational skills, how are the foundational skills being implemented? Are they systematic and direct? So I think that it's that balance between systematic support, right? And then the comprehension support as well. So I would love to, I could talk about this for a very long time. And I think that it might be something that we can return to throughout the session as well. So thank you so much for sharing that. And for allowing me to kind of invite you to hop on and share your thinking as well for text 2 and text 1.
yeah, my apologies for not being right on.
Oh my goodness, you are no need to apologize at all. I deeply appreciate you jumping in. So no apologies necessary, and appreciate your thinking. So just thinking about text 1 and text 2, when thinking about the author's main idea and the author's purpose for writing, like what is it really about? And I saw some responses in the chat as well. But in the interest of time, I'll just share with you all what our thinking was around the author's intention for these 2 passages. So for text 1, it's really about Lincoln's previous political experience and how it didn't quite prepare him for presidency, right? And we had talked about heavy is the head that wears the crown, and the responsibility and attention that came with that role for him, and how it was different than his previous work. In text 2, although I agree with you, Lisa, that the language is more flowery in certain ways, it's really about Lincoln's facial expressions and how Lincoln's face could express many different emotions. And so now that we've kind of briefly touched upon the author's intention and reason for writing these 2 passages, and we've looked kind of carefully at them several times, let's take the poll again and reflect on which one, after reviewing carefully, would be more appropriate and complex for the 11th grade. And it looks like, thanks, Tabitha, we've got that poll up again. And thank you for those folks. There were some folks that like boom jumped right in to do that poll. I appreciate that, and for those being reflective as well. So right now about 56% of us believe that text 1 is more appropriate. And if you selected text 1, go ahead and put your name in the chat if you were someone who selected text 1. Thanks. Ruth Ann, would you mind telling us, coming off mute and telling us a little bit about why you selected text 1?
I found that there was more embedded information in there, and kids had to use critical, high-level thinking to really understand it.
Absolutely, Ruth Ann. Thank you so much for sharing your thinking with us. That's also what we found, although they're both complex in different ways. Text 1 is more complex for the 11th grade students. And although text 2 includes some complex vocabulary and some more complex sentence structures, as we touched on, text 1 includes all of these things and includes a broader, more sophisticated subject matter, which makes it more complex. And so this activity really teaches us, if we kind of step back from the text and think about it from a more metacognitive level, it really teaches us that we must truly consider all 3 indicators as well as the text holistically to help us determine its complexity, and to better support our students shifting away from teaching skills in isolation, thinking about teaching complex texts. So qualitative text complexity rubrics for literature and informational texts can be found on Achieve the Core, and we've also included them in our note catcher as well. So these rubrics allow teachers to identify the qualitative complexities that can be so nuanced for us to find, and gives us that shared language to move through this practice together. They also allow teachers to identify those qualitative complexities that show up in a text and then inform instruction. So teachers may ask questions about these complexities or slow down reading in the chunks in which they appear. So there are 4 main categories, which you can see here on the slide. There's meaning and purpose, text structure, language features, and knowledge demands. I'll go ahead and just give us 2 minutes to peruse the qualitative rubric, which you can find linked in your note catcher. And you can just chat done as soon as you are ready to move forward. I'm also sharing it in the chat as well, just in case that's easier for you.
Mark, can I jump in and ask a question?
Always, absolutely. Thank you so much.
So I'm a huge fan of William Van Cleve and followed a lot of his work. And one of the things that he spent a lot of time talking about when looking at text complexity is sentence structure, and really being able to think about how complex a sentence is, how clear it is who the subject of the sentence is, and when students have to make more inferences about which he they're referring to, that adds a great deal to text complexity. And I feel like I'm not really seeing much of that on this rubric. And when I think back to the 2 texts that we just looked at, I really thought text 2 had so much more complex sentences, and it wasn't always clear who was being spoken about. That makes it actually much more complex for the students to understand, even though the content was quite a bit easier. Do you guys think about that at all when you're looking at these texts?
Carolyn, I so appreciate like the thoughtfulness and just the nuance embedded with your question, and just I feel like it's really indicative of how thoroughly you're engaging with the content, and I just appreciate that professionally. I have a thought, and then I would love to just invite it to open it up to any other TNT peers if they want to jump in. I think when we talk about text complexity, we're thinking about building word and world knowledge, right? So although I feel like text 2 does have that word knowledge or that relationship to language in the qualitative features of it, in terms of building world knowledge, there's many more sophisticated ideas and historical references that are embedded in text 1. In addition to, although perhaps not quite as qualitatively sophisticated, but there are some qualitative language structures within text 1 in addition to that world knowledge and historical kind of point there as well. So I think, you know, it's also, again, the meta perspective is these are the types of conversations, right, that we want our teachers to be engaging in. Which one is it? Why exactly? Where in the text, right? What about the language? Where will I zoom in on when I'm teaching this with my students? Because it's not always black and white, especially with qualitative or linguistic features. And again, that's why this rubric can be really helpful just as a norming device when you're sitting down to say, okay, here's our chapter for today at our grade team meeting. How could we, you know, use this rubric to then focus in on a close reading, right? Small group. I don't know if that's helpful. Any other TNT peers, if you want to jump in.
I feel like that makes sense because you had mentioned that content is the most foundational tool, and so you're kind of saying like the content piece kind of trumps everything else when they're somewhat equivalent.
Yeah, and I think, thank you for that. And I think it's not necessarily always going to trump everything else, right? It is going to be more specific to each text. But when we make the transition to complex text being at the heart of our instruction and really the foundation of all other learning and literacy, then that's when these types of conversations become so text specific um, and student specific in some cases, and really important to have. So I appreciate you jumping in. I appreciate you interrupting. And it's not even an interruption, but fielding this question because it is so nuanced. So thank you for that, Carolyn. Okay, so now we're not to bring it on back, but we'll bring it on back. We're going to have the opportunity to do some practice using the tool itself. So the final thing that we want to be considering, and this is another tricky nuance section, right, worthy of our conversation, but we want to consider the extent to which the text is worth student time and attention. Okay, so we have limited time with our students. As we all know, teachers just want more time, right? So we need to really be stopping before we start to consider whether or not the texts exhibit exceptional craft, build content or cultural knowledge, and are worth rereading. So we also know that in Massachusetts, you've done some exceptional work around culturally responsive teaching and text worthiness through that CRT lens. So we would love to have you just share in the chat, what your experience has been with this focus as well. And you can also hop off mute if you'd like to share your perspective there. So as you're all reflecting, this no problem. You can just take your time to think about it. When texts exhibit exceptional craft and thought, they provide useful information and sometimes contain rich illustrations. We also want to consider, are these texts authentic or were they written solely for the purpose of teaching of students reading them in this class period? Just see some responses coming in. Thank you, Carolyn. Absolutely. Thank you, Abby. Excellent. I love the idea of students applying craft moves into their own writing as well, that applicability. Ultimately, we want to be asking ourselves, are these texts relevant? Are they worth reading closely and rereading? This is also a way that we can build engagement in literacy, and through that engagement, lean into accelerated practices. Speaking of practice, we're going to have the opportunity, as I mentioned, to do some hands-on practice with a text. In a moment, I will, or Tabitha has already done it. Thank you, Tabitha. We'll share that link in the chat, so you can just peek on over to the chat and link into that. I'm going to give us all 3 minutes to read through the text and practice rating the text using the content section from our tool. I'll put those directions in the chat as well, just so we have another place to reference them. After 3 minutes, so at about 12:53, I'll just bring us back together with my voice and set us up to go into breakouts and have a quick discussion there. So I'll put those directions in the chat. You can work with camera off if that's more comfortable to you, and we'll come back together at 12:53. Okay, thanks everyone. I'm going to invite us all to come back on camera if you were off, and welcome back. Thank you so much for taking a very quick couple of minutes to begin this process in this practice and application. It's okay if you did not finish, totally fine. We're going to go into breakouts for just a quick 2 minutes to share our preliminary thinking and just do some brainstorming together where you're at generally with this article and with the tool. And then I'll bring us back together for whole group and kind of go over some of those findings. So with that, Tabitha is going to open breakouts, and then welcome back, everyone. Appreciate your work in breakouts there and your thoughts on this text and on the tool. So here on this slide, you can see some of our findings. And before we get into them, I would just quickly love to hear from Abby to share out your noticings and thoughts on the article.
Sure. The two things that I had just pointed out when I was looking at the rubric, the first thing was the intertextuality and the number of citations for further study, should students want to. But the other thing I pointed out was the domain-specific language and thinking of a possible barrier for students, because I said, as somebody in my 40s, I'm looking at joint pain and conjunctivitis, and I get it. I know what all that is, but for a sixth grader, it might not be the frame of knowledge for them. So I was looking at some of the vocabulary as well.
Thank you so much, Abby. Like, I just want to lift up how you were leveraging the components of the tool and then looking at the text through the lens of that tool. So appreciate that. And you can see some of those characteristics of complex text on the bottom, as well as the quantitative and qualitative features that we teased out. You can see the Lexile band, making this text quantitatively appropriate and complex for a sixth grade audience, as well as the qualitative measures, and some of which Abby pulled out in terms of that specific language as well. And so just to kind of look at it in the framework of the tool itself, which we can see on the next slide. Thank you so much. So we can see, is this assignment based on a text? You would be surprised from the opportunity myth how many ELA classrooms there was just no text at all. There was no text in the instruction that we found. So we start with, is there a text at the center of this lesson? Yes, there is. Okay. And then we ask, are the texts high quality and grade appropriate? Yes, they are. And that we have the Lexiles on grade level, and it also has that relevant qualitative features that we identified as well. So just to close out this portion of our time, and thank you all so much for your active participation. In the chat, we're just going to share the link to our full student work library. And as school leaders and as leaders, you can leverage this library. It's completely open, right? And so you can take any assignments if you want to use for PLC practice or grade team practice using this tool as well. So that will be in the chat, and I believe it's in the note catcher as well, that you can lean into for your own planning and applicability in your school setting. So thank you all so much. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Irene.
Thank you, Margaret. So thank you all for your engagement this last hour. We really appreciate how deeply you're engaging and participating in the work today. So now that we've looked at why it's important to accelerate learning for our students, and we've looked at how we can ensure that the assignments we give students are aligned to grade level standards, now we're going to look at what steps we can take to ensure that students have the necessary knowledge and skills to access Tier 1 learning. When you have heard of or participated in conversations about accelerated learning, you've likely heard about the importance of planning for scaffolds. And I know we've even talked a very little bit about it today. However, before that can take place, we need to identify the most critical prerequisite content students need to access Tier 1 instruction. It's in that way that we're able to find out what content students may need scaffolded in order to move them and keep them in grade level learning. So again, this step is very critical. When we skip this step, we're essentially ineffectively planning for how we will then plan for how we support students, which then often inadvertently leads to denying students access to Tier 1 instruction, and more likely leads to over remediation. So first, to accelerate learning and literacy, it's important that educators have a solid understanding of what it means to teach students to read. And although we have evidence-based research that's been out for nearly 15 years about how children, especially young children, learn to read, educators have not all embrace the idea that for most students, actually roughly 70% of all children, learning to read requires that teachers work to develop students in two critical areas. The first one being reading each word in text accurately and fluently, what we often refer to as the skill-based competencies, phonics, or foundational skills. And the second one being reading, comprehending the meaning of text being read. So meaning-based competencies, sometimes called reading comprehension. So acceleration for each of these competencies can look slightly different. And for our purposes, we're going to focus on accelerating learning for meaning-based competencies today. So when I say we're going to look at accelerating literacy, I'm referring to the specific steps that take place in planning and instruction in these three phases that you see on your screen. So we're going to unpack these a bit, but I would like to also alert you to the slide deck that's shared in the handout. It has a more comprehensive explanation of these three phases. It's more than what you see on the screen, so I encourage you to refer to that to see all of the indicators for each of these stages. So let's start with understand. So understanding grade level content and what it looks like in practice. So here the teacher deeply understands their grade level content and the prerequisite knowledge and skills that students need to successfully access and navigate rigorous instruction. Then we have diagnose. So we diagnose student understanding of those prerequisite concepts and skills in order to understand what students do and do not know yet. It's important to highlight here that we're not talking about the large scale formal diagnostics that we typically see in systems across the country at the beginning of the year. Here we're talking about curriculum embedded, unit specific diagnostics and formative assessments. And then finally, we have take action. So we take action by planning for and executing effective instructional practices. So here, the teacher is pairing their knowledge of high quality grade level content and their knowledge of what their students already know or need to support with accessing the lesson. And we use that to execute meaningful instruction and design systems of support for all students. So I know that's a lot of information, so I'm just going to stop here for a little bit of processing time. So we're going to go back to the top here with understand, the first step to planning to accelerate learning. So to accelerate learning in reading comprehension, educators begin with grade level appropriate complex texts. Once complex texts are in place, educators must then understand the key topics and qualitative aspects of that text in order to prepare to accelerate learning. So understanding what makes this text complex and worthy of instructional time and discussion. So today we're looking at those 3 pieces, and we've already done quite a bit of that with Margaret. And this information, grade level content, it's just one piece of information that you'll use to identify appropriate scaffolds. And we have a little plug there for our upcoming sessions around building schema in November and designing scaffolds in December. So those are all the components that go into designing the scaffolds. Today, we're focusing on these first 3 areas. So for example, I'd like for you for today to envision a 7th grade ELA classroom where the teacher has already gone through the process of selecting a grade level appropriate text through a qualitative and quantitative analysis. So kind of like what we just did a few moments ago with Margaret. Even if you're working with high quality curriculum or high quality instructional materials, it's still important to engage in that analysis to have a very thorough understanding of your materials. So in this particular 7th grade year, students will read and discuss texts about individuals that overcome and persevere in the face of incredible obstacles. And the anchor text for this first unit is A Long Walk to Water. In case this text is unfamiliar to you, please take a moment to just read that very short synopsis in the text box. So students may need support building knowledge and accessing academic vocabulary and language in order to fully comprehend and appreciate text. So while 7th graders may be able to read this text in a foundational skills way, in other words, they can decode the words of the text and read it fluently, they might miss the key ideas of the text or even misinterpret what the author is trying to convey because of coming with different background knowledge or the need for more language development, academic vocabulary necessary to fully comprehend and express what they think is happening in the text. In that case, students, again, may need advanced preparation with the topics that are covered and the language that's used in the text. Very quickly, especially if you are familiar already with this text, what background knowledge might be helpful for students to have in order to access this text? Thanks, Abby. Great. So thank you for those responses, and just to show you your thinking is spot on. In meaning making or reading comprehension, we can accelerate learning through building prior knowledge and developing academic vocabulary. So for this particular text, for A Long Walk to Water, you all have already listed some of the topics that the students might need a deeper understanding of while they're engaging in the text or before engaging in the text. Another approach is to also have students read supplemental texts like you see there with Lost Boy, Lost Girl, or How Dare the Sun Rise, prior to the start of reading A Long Walk to Water. These 2 texts in particular, they're informational texts and cover the same time period and region as the anchor text, but they are also slightly less complex. Because all 3 texts cover the same topic, students are building that background knowledge that they need to tackle the anchor text, and they're familiarizing themselves with the kind of academic language and vocabulary that they'll most likely encounter in the core text. With all of that said, we do want to also point out that reading supplemental text is not the only way to build background knowledge and prepare students to access complex text. Would like for you to share in the text box How might a teacher diagnose what knowledge students may already have when coming to this text? So again, we can build background knowledge through reading supplemental texts, but there are other ways to also build and access background knowledge. So in this case, what might the teacher do? Great, thank you, Ruth Ann and Christina. So just as Ruth Ann and Christina have pointed out, both of these strategies or approaches, they leverage collaborative conversation. So activities that activate prior knowledge by leveraging students' assets and their funds of knowledge support with that necessary schema building, which in turn provides students greater access to grade level text and tasks that they otherwise may not have been able to access. So in our case with A Long Walk to Water, we may have students engaging in collaborative experiential activities around familiar themes that exist in the text, such as society, perseverance, courage. And we also want to utilize, in addition to supplemental text, we want to utilize these types of activities that activate prior knowledge as they affirm student identity. They acknowledge that students come to classrooms with knowledge and experiences, and that those resources they have are resources for learning. So it is a very asset-based approach that provides students with more entry points into the new learning. Again, these activities are usually collaborative. They allow students to negotiate concepts in oral, familiar language, including their home language. They also focus primarily on the central concept at the heart of the lesson or unit, so that it establishes a base where all new subsequent learning can be built upon. So it's a very comprehensive approach. Again, it doesn't need to be through text. It can rely on visuals or minimal text with a low linguistic load that grants access to all students regardless of their literacy level. And what we have here are a few meaning-based practices that we're going to dive more deeply into in a future session. But for today, what's important to know is that, as it says there, when a student is struggling with accessing text, the solution is not remediation. Accelerate understanding by focusing on these key meaning-based practices, which we've highlighted a few from today, focusing on using informational text, granting students opportunities for authentic engagement with new language through writing and speaking. And again, we'll be going through more of these in a future session, but we did want to provide you all with a chance to practice some of the thinking that we've just shared with you around identifying prerequisite content. So today we'll have a chance to do a bit of practice. I'd like it for right now, you can navigate to the handout to locate a link to a text that we're going to ask you to spend a few minutes reading called The Great Fire. So take a moment to locate that text so that you have it ready to engage. Great, so thanks. It's in the chat if you have not been able to find it. So what we're going to do next is a bit of practice with identifying prerequisite content. So what we have here is the text, The Great Fire. It's an informational text. And we have gone ahead and done those first steps of ensuring that it is a grade appropriate text for 6th grade. So you can see on the screen the Lexile bands for the different grade levels. And Margaret mentioned these earlier when we were talking about the task analysis tool. And we can see here that this text falls well within the range of what is appropriate for a sixth grader. So in case you're unfamiliar with the text, The Great Fire tells the story of the 1871 Chicago fire by weaving together narrative accounts from survivors with researched history as well. And again, we see that it's appropriate quantitatively, given the Lexile level. And we also know that it's qualitatively rich and builds knowledge about the world. That would be that second step you see there of conducting the qualitative analysis. Again, you might be using a curriculum that provides this to you, ensuring that the text is grade appropriate qualitatively and quantitatively. It is still important to engage in this step. So what we're going to do now is we're going to give you all some time to read that text, and then we're going to go into breakout groups and use the rubric as well as our own analysis of the text to determine what knowledge students might need to be built prior to engaging in this text, and also what are some examples of key vocabulary that would help students to comprehend the text and develop their language prior to fully engaging. So let's take about 3 to 4 minutes here to just read the text and do our own individual analysis so that we're ready to discuss when we go to breakout groups. And we'll put those directions and links in the chat just to make sure we're all on the same page. Feel free also to go off video while you read, and we'll pull you back at about 10:24 so that you can share your analysis of the prerequisite knowledge and language students may need. All right, so welcome back. We're going to go into breakout groups in a moment. And I know it can be sometimes challenging to engage in these conversations for the first time. We want our ideas to be fully put together, to be correct. But I want to remind us of our norm of, not striving for perfection, that this is practice. And our goal right now is not really to calibrate on the tool, given the amount of time that we have. It's really to just become familiar with engaging with these tools and resources as a way to then also support the teachers that you work with in engaging in this kind of exercise for the benefit of their students. So with that, we're going to go into breakout groups for about 5 minutes, where you're going to discuss the knowledge and skills that students would maybe need prior to reading this text, as well as what necessary language they would need to develop. And if you have time, also take a look at the rubric together to see where your ideas are landing so far. And with that, we're going to go ahead and open our breakouts and come back together at about 10:30. Great, welcome back everyone. And thank you for engaging in the conversation with us. I would love to hear some takeaways from the groups, or even my colleagues. I know Margaret said there was a great discussion, and Katie, if there's anything you would like to share or to hear out from your group around those first 2 questions.
I can kick us off, Irene, if that's okay. Abby and Philomena were just really getting me all fired up thinking about building background knowledge. So I don't know, Abby, Philomena, if you want to hop on. We were discussing multilingual learners and building content knowledge.
So I was just talking about just being able to see the city as it was, because that's not anything that kids are going to have a frame of reference for. So to be able to see pictures of what these structures looked like could be helpful. And also, I was thinking at the very end there with the fires, even just all the current events around fires, and just how climate and the current events that might be able to draw kids into this idea of the different factors that go into why fires happen and why they spread so easily.
Thanks for that, Abby. And I love, making that connection to current events and making it so relevant for students at the start of the unit. Great. Anything else you could add there?
We were saying maybe an understanding of fire departments or the lack of fire safety back in 1871, the idea of fire hydrants weren't around, and what that supports, what supports were available.
Great, thanks, Tiffany. And how about for this second one? Well, just giving it away, but anything else you all would add to what are some of the key vocabulary that students would need to comprehend the text and that would develop their language? And I know there it says specifically vocabulary, but even just thinking about language more broadly in general. Anything you would add?
In our group, Christina made a good point around potentially showing pictures of things like kindling to make it really clear what exactly that was.
Great, thanks, Katie. So I like you all are taking that next step to think of how are you going to do that, recognizing, yes, exactly, that vocabulary around fire, like it says on the slide there. So anything else you all would add here around the prior knowledge or the language students would need? Great. So going to very quickly just touch on the rubric. Something want to make sure to clarify is that when you're going through that qualitative analysis of the text, we're thinking about what makes this text complex in and of itself, not what is going to be complex or challenging for your particular group of students. That step comes later as you're thinking about the language demands, the knowledge demands of the text. And here we can see that this text in terms of complexity was rated rather low. Hopefully in your group, you got a chance to begin talking about it, but this is again, the type of conversation we want to encourage teachers to have. So they're being more intentional about those eventual meaning-based practices that they choose to support their students with. And again, we're going to be getting into those a bit more in our upcoming sessions. But with that, I'm going to transfer it back to Margaret to quickly summarize what we've gone through and lead us into our next section.
Absolutely. Thank you, Irene. I'm excited for the next section because we're going to get to close out and think about all the ways that we can really apply this to our own school setting and those practical applications that we're all looking for. But in terms of what we've done so far, you've all done a wonderful job participating. Thank you so much for that. But we've thought about the why behind why it's so critical to provide grade appropriate assignments to accelerate learning. We've talked a bit about the how in terms of how do we and our teachers and our teams identify assignments that truly do give students that opportunity to do grade level learning because it's tricky. And we also want to figure out how do we identify the most critical prerequisite content to address so students can access grade level learning, which Irene just did a fabulous job walking us through. So now we're going to transition. Now that we have a clearer picture of what strong accelerated instruction looks like in ELA, we're going to pause for a minute to consider how close or how far your school's instruction currently is from that vision of acceleration. So what we're going to do here is take 2 minutes, and we can turn cameras off if we like, to just reflect on these questions on the slide. So how close or how far is your school currently from a vision of grade appropriate assignments and acceleration in literacy, and how do you know? And what might a school have to have in place for this kind of accelerated strong literacy instruction to take place? And as I mentioned, we're all going to just take a minute to think and be brainstorming. And from there, we'll get the chance to actually do some planning and lean into that with our colleagues. So I will stop talking and give us 2 minutes to do some drafting for these questions. It is 1:39 now, so I'm going to welcome us all back together. And just want to name that you've done an amazing job so far. We've got just one more activity till close, so we appreciate all of you kind of finishing strong with us this afternoon. And we also know that the work that we're doing, while kind of general in nature, is also really specific to each one of you in your own individual school environments. And so this final portion of our time together is really about tailoring the conversation to your own school environment and to your own needs. And so with that, we know that leaders have a few levers in their schools to ensure that they can systematize change. And these levers, which can be found on the upcoming slide, impact teacher behaviors and thus student outcomes. So we're going to discuss these 4 levers now, and then we'll have some time to get into breakouts and do some planning and conversation with Rolla-like colleagues regarding how we can actually leverage them in our school. So there are 4 main inputs that you as leaders can utilize to impact the systems that you choose to enact, right? Whether they be around assessments and progress monitoring, climate and culture, and so forth. So our first one is communicating expectations, right? When we're trying to make a big change in our school environment, we can think about how do we communicate expectations? What are the precise expectations of adults? And what will you do to communicate to teachers? Next, we can think about tools. So what tools will the adults need to meet expectations? After that, we have support. So what support or development do the adults need to implement the system? And lastly, everyone's favorite, or maybe it's just my favorite, time, right? What time will adults need to learn and refine this implementation? And so, as I mentioned, we really did want to take this final activity and kind of tailor it to your own needs and to your school as well. So for the remainder of the session, we are going to have the opportunity to go into breakouts to discuss some of these questions and ideas related to the key levers and also related to your own school ecosystem. So what we're going to do is actually have you select which breakout room you will be joining. And I'll just give us
Sorry,
like,
Margaret.
oh yes, go ahead.
I think we are in the chat. We made an executive decision to not do that. We're just going to put everyone back in their same groups. Sorry.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you, Tabitha, for letting me know. So I think that when we go into breakout rooms, then we can still use this as a time to share with our colleagues. What have you identified in terms of where your school is in terms of learning acceleration, and kind of what lever you might like to utilize as a school leader to help take your school to the next level. So you can share our ideas or brainstorm questions with each other to help move our work forward together. So we should be opening our room shortly, and we will see you back here in about 4 minutes. Back, everyone. Thank you so much for those breakouts. Philomena, I didn't get the chance to affirm that, yes, in fact, it makes sense. So thank you for that. Hate to leave you hanging. But with that, I'm actually going to bring us into a closing reflection so we can share out some of our conversation as well during this space. So for our closing reflection or final activity today, we would love for you to select one of the sentence starters that you see here on the slide, thinking about our conversations that we've had and all of the points that we've shared with you today, and select one. I recognize, I learned, I'm surprised by, I want to learn more about, and then go ahead and share your phrase in the chat. And from there, we'll also be putting a survey in the chat because we would absolutely love and welcome all of the feedback that you have for us today. So I'll give us a moment to share our closing reflections. And also invite anyone who's feeling inspired to come off mute and share your reflections out loud. We would absolutely love to hear them as well. Thanks, Susan, for kicking us off. Just-in-time interventions, excellent. I want to learn more about balancing foundational skills, needs with accelerating content. Super helpful. Thanks, Abby. I recognize the importance of ensuring students have access to grade level reading material. Love to see that. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Christina. Please do keep these reflections coming. Tabitha shared the survey in the chat as well, and we'll keep putting that out there so you can link into it. We look through the responses carefully and tailor our work moving forward to better suit your needs based on your feedback. So thank you for that. And the next slide will also give you our contact information. So if you have specific questions that Irene or I could be helpful with, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I'm sure Irene as well. And so with that, we just thank you so much. We know how valuable your time is, and we are so grateful that you took that time to be with us here today. So wishing you all a wonderful rest of your day, and we hope to see you again at our next session.
Thank you, everyone. Wonderful having you today.